Imagine a world where multinational mining corporations can dictate the price of your everyday objects. I mean, copper is used in everyday electronics, iron's used in everyday construction, and nickel and manganese is used in everyday surgical equipment. They have the power to dictate the prices on each of these products because they're the ones providing the resources to make it. So that brings us to the problem. Multinational mining corporations, or MMCs as we'll be referring to them throughout this presentation, have a lot of power. Anglo American, the fifth largest MMC, owns 40% of the world's diamond, iron, platinum, copper, nickel, and manganese, and even more. They own so much and they're allowed to dictate all the prices on each of these objects. And according to them, they own all of these, well, at least 40% of these. So that brings us, and don't think that they're not going to just change up the prices because they feel bad. They are known to do this. De Beers Diamonds, of which Anglo American is majority shareholder, is known to create artificial shortages just so they can have the best price for them. According to James Wilson in the Financial Times, De Beers Diamonds was buying second-hand diamonds to ensure the demand was staying low so all the prices stayed high. And they would do the exact opposite just to benefit them again. And so, according to Tobias Krimpscher of the London Business School, under the supervision of Professor Luis Cabral, De Beers was in charge of Zaire and was actually undercutting Zaire as they were selling diamonds to them. Eventually, Zaire realized this and tried to escape and go into the free market, and De Beers released a bunch of diamonds into the market to ensure the prices would go down so that Zaire would have no choice but to turn around and come crying back to De Beers. This shows they don't care about the money that's coming out of your pocket, they only care about the money that's going into theirs.
Industrial mining and MMCs have been causing many environmental problems for years now. An example of environmental damage caused by industrial mining would be acid mine drainage. Acid mine drainage is when water molecules come into contact with sulfide ore deposits, creating strong acids that can flow into other water sources. Dragana Adamovic, a member of the Mining and Metallurgy Institute in Serbia, says that pollutants from mining areas are flowing into rivers and other water sources, contaminating drinking water and killing aquatic life. Another example of environmental damage would be vegetation degradation. Baodong Ma, an author of an article detailing the amount of vegetation growing around mining areas, says that the amount of vegetation growing around mining areas is much less compared to the amount of vegetation growing around non-mining areas. This shows that vegetation degradation is a direct cause, or is a direct problem of industrial mining. This is a problem because vegetation degradation affects animal habitats and the food that animals eat. This just goes to show how industrial mining damages the ecology as well as the environment.
Now, looking at this issue from an ethical perspective, we can see that these MMCs are also responsible for a variety of human rights abuses throughout several African countries, such as Zimbabwe, Sierra Leone, and Guatemala. This is mostly due to the fact that these countries want to come in and simply industrialize these pre-existing mines. The issue with this is that these pre-existing mines almost always coexist with a village that just gets in the way of the industrialization process. In fact, according to Simbarashe Gukurume, an author who works for the Institute of Humanities in Africa, recently the Zimbabwe government has sent hundreds, if not thousands, of soldiers into these small rural communities in order to clear out these civilians in order to make room for these mines. As a result, these people have lost their homes, their careers, their personal rights, their complex family structures, and their land, which to many of them is very symbolic. Additionally, any villagers who refused or even hesitated to leave their home were either murdered or brutally beaten. Now, taking a bit of a turn from industrial and looking at individual or artisanal mining, we can see that this practice tends to be much more beneficial to these smaller communities, as it can often greatly help alleviate poverty by providing careers that may not have been there originally. Additionally, it's also great at reducing crime rates, especially among the youth, by providing essentially an outlet to these disenfranchised children. Of course, some of the negatives of individual mining is that it's clearly much more dangerous. They're using much less refined practices with little to no regulations, and most of these individual miners have much less of a clue of what they're doing than these individual corporations. Additionally, individual miners are very easy to take advantage of considering their lack of global connectivity. They almost always set their prices based on global standards, which means that the local buyer can undercut their prices to such a point that they can sell it for much more and make a huge profit.
So, given the various problems that MMCs and industrial mining causes, we must ask the question, how can we stop the power abuses of multinational mining corporations? Well, we have devised two possible solutions to this problem.
The first solution would be government regulations. Government of the host countries can determine what power the MMCs have over them, not the other way around. Some possible regulations that they could implement would be workers' rights, pollution, and political power. The EPA currently uses some of these regulations in American mines. That's why we don't have some of the problems that I've described today.
The advantages of this solution will be great, as regulations have been proven to work quickly, efficiently, and effectively. Regulations can also be very effective when considering the fact that we are able to maintain some form of industrialization, which often can bring careers or education to these smaller rural communities that don't necessarily have this to begin with. Additionally, regulations can be very useful when mitigating some of the environmental issues that we've discussed, as we can establish general emission regulations that can prevent these companies from polluting more than what should be acceptable.
However, there are several issues with government regulations. The first being that government regulations could possibly decline the GDP in the host country. This is because the government regulations would not be supported by these MMCs, which would most likely cause them to leave the country, lowering the GDP as a result. The second problem with government regulations is that they could prove ineffective, which would especially be the case if said government of the host country just decided to ignore them. The third and final problem with government regulations is that they would require the governments of these host countries to take action, meaning that they could not stand by and let these MMCs corrupt and take all the money for themselves.
So this brings us to our second solution, which is that rather than relying on industry, we simply establish individual cooperatives in these small local communities that really need them. Now, essentially what a cooperative is a business that is equally owned and run by these member owners. So the same people who are doing the work and hard labor for a business are the same people who are making executive decisions and purchases for that same company. Additionally, with a cooperative, resources are pooled and shared equally among everybody. This includes both profits and expenses, which ensures that everyone in a cooperative is held to the same standard.
Now, the good thing about individual cooperatives is that decisions are made democratically by those who are most affected, the host country, not by what giant MMC says would be best for them. And prices are set based on global markets, again, not based on what some monopoly thinks is going to be best for them. And finally, members of the community are enabled to take action. Soon they'll start to feel like they are beneficial to their society and not being taken advantage of by some giant MMC.
Although there are many positive attributes to establishing cooperatives, there are still several issues. The first being that establishing a cooperative requires effort and motivation from every member. This means that every member that is establishing said cooperative would have to be an active leader and be invested in establishing the cooperative. The second problem with establishing the cooperative is that capital access is limited. This is especially true in many lower class and third world countries where these cooperatives would be most effective. The third problem with cooperatives is that they are complex to manage. This means that low-level, uneducated miners that are trying to establish or manage a cooperative could have it crumble beneath their feet because they are simply not educated enough to establish or to manage said cooperative.
So after weighing both the pros and cons of our two proposed solutions, we have come to the conclusion that solution 2 is likely our best option, as for one, with it, workers' rights are much better protected than they would be under just some regulations.
And the MMC's power abuses would be curbed. You wouldn't have a giant MMC coming in and deciding what would be best for that country, as I've said before. And the host country's economies will stabilize. We wouldn't have a case like Zaire where the MMC comes in and decides what the price should be set at. It's decided by them.
Finally, cooperatives would ultimately lead to a much cleaner environment, as the workers of the cooperative would be more likely to care about the country that they are living in and to maintain it than some giant multinational corporation would.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. Calvin, give one specific way that your thinking changed as a result of learning about Jameson's findings in his IRR.
Well, my research mainly dealt with the political and economic fact of how MMCs come into a country, and I really didn't take into account that the environment would be a big effect. I mean, it would be illogical for them to come in and just tear up the land because it's going to be best for them, because they're actually going to need that land in the long run. And so I thought they were taking care of it good enough until I started reading into Jameson's research and found that they aren't taking very good care of it, and it could be bad in the long run.
Very good. Okay. Joshua, how did the group decide to include Calvin's perspective, lens, or conclusion in the overall presentation?
So again, he dealt mostly with the political and economic side of things, which we obviously took a huge part of. Whenever I did my research, mine was almost entirely about how are these small communities affected. I didn't take into consideration at all how these industrial corporations, they can bring things into these smaller communities, which we've showed there are some benefits to having MMCs, which me and Jameson didn't really discuss in our research.
Okay. And Jameson, describe how the content of the team presentation was changed as a result of group discussion.
Well, initially, our group was going to focus on space mining, but we decided that there wasn't enough research on that, so we decided to go into mineral mining on the Earth. And so we decided that we would each take one aspect and lens, and mostly the conclusion was that we were going to focus more on the political aspect, because that is what giant mining corporations are about, politics and money. So we focused on a lot about Calvin's presentation and TMP IRR, because it had the most valuable information.